Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lizette Coley, and as the Executive Director of Parapsychology Foundation, and on behalf of our President, Mrs. Eileen Coley back there, and our Board of Trustees, I welcome you all here this evening. We're very pleased to have as our speaker tonight Nancy L. Zingrone. I want to read a little bit about her because she's had quite an illustrious career. Nancy has a Bachelor of Arts with honors in psychology from Mundelein College and a Master's of Science in Community College Education with a teaching specialty in psychology from Northern Illinois University. She obtained doctoral candidacy in the histories of science and medicine at Duke University before she withdrew from the program and applied to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where she's currently a doctoral candidate in psychology. Since 1979, she has taught college-level courses in statistics and in parapsychology at Northeastern Illinois University and Mundelein College, and adult education courses in parapsychology at Harold Washington College and at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. She has also taught for more than a decade in the Summer Study Institute program at the Institute for Parapsychology in Durham, North Carolina, and has designed and taught an online course through the auspices of the Ibero-American Association of Parapsychology, an organization of which she was a founding member, and for which I think she serves as treasurer presently. As for her scientific training in parapsychology, she was a research fellow at the Institute for Parapsychology, which now, of course, we refer to as the Rhine Research Center, in Durham from 1982 to 1985, and a visiting scholar from 1986 to 1993, where she conducted experimental research, including the first Gansfeld work done at the Institute, with, among others, her colleague George Hansen, who I believe is here with us this evening also. In addition, she has completed a number of survey studies with, among others, her colleague Dr. Carlos S. Alvarado, who is also with us tonight. Nancy has been a member of the Board of Directors of the Parapsychological Association for most of the last 10 years. She edited the association's newsletter from 1990 to 1999 and the 1993 proceedings. She was elected president of the Parapsychological Association for the 2000-2001 term and will deliver her presidential address next year in New York when we at Parapsychology Foundation host the annual PA convention. In recent times, she has managed the publication of books and journals in Puerto Rico through her publishing house, Puente Publications. And currently, she is the director of publications of the Parapsychology Foundation and the executive editor of the soon-to-be reappearing International Journal of Parapsychology, as well as the associate editor of the series Advances in Parapsychological Research. She'll be joining the staff of the Parapsychology Foundation, for which we're very pleased, full-time in July of this year. So at this point, I will happily turn you over to Nancy as she presents the effect of criticism, skeptics, parapsychology, and experiences. Nancy. Thank you. Let me get this all straightened out here. I have the videographer's undying annoyance, probably. 4 transparencies tonight only. Is that as unproductively visible to you guys as it is to me?
Focus.
That better? Yeah.
Keep going.
Keep going. Okay.
Yes.
Ready? Yes. Okay. Okay. I'm defining criticism for the sake of this talk as any criticism of parapsychology that has been leveled at us from the outside. I'll make a couple of exceptions to this. From people who are skeptical of the existence of any paranormal phenomena, from people who are skeptical of the existence of just a few of the phenomena that we study, from people who believe that anyone who claims to have paranormal abilities or to take them so seriously as to want to investigate them, that those people are uneducated, improperly educated, badly educated, or suffering from some mental illness. The kinds of criticisms that are leveled against us are not, unhappily, as objective as one would want, or as dispassionate as one would want. So some of the examples that I'll be giving you are some of the extreme ones. Criticism can also be understood to be the methodological and theoretical criticism that's the coin of the realm in science. that every scientist or theorist should take seriously by applying it personally to their own work before they present or publish, and by applying it to the work of their colleagues at conventions or in print. I'm going to be talking mostly about criticism that comes from the outside of parapsychology, and especially when I'm talking about the consequences of criticism, I'll be talking about what comes mostly from the outside. A little bit of background about how I got involved in the critics game. I am doing a thesis at the University of Edinburgh that's called, euphemistically, From Text to Self. This title will probably change in a month or two. The history of criticism and response in parapsychology. I discovered, as I began to gather bibliography about 4 or 5 years ago for what I thought was going to be an exhaustive and comprehensive review of all the criticism and response that had ever been published in the English language literature, I discovered that what Eberhard Bauer said in 1984 in his review of criticism in the European Journal of Parapsychology, I discovered this was true, that the history of parapsychology is practically synonymous with the history of controversy. By the time I got probably 3/4 of the way through my literature review, I had more than 2,000 individual items of criticism and response. And it became obvious to myself and my advisors that I would either be doing a 25-year-long PhD thesis, or we would have to petition the university for 1,000 or 1,500 pages, as opposed to the 350 pages that they usually allot us. So the thesis had to be narrowed, and now, at this point, and I'm nearly finished, so hopefully this is the end of the narrowing, we have narrowed it down to the publication of J.B. Rhine's monograph, Extrasensory Perception, which occurred in 1934. It sparked off a firestorm of criticism in the American academic and especially the psychological literature between 1934 and 1940. His team at the Parapsychology Laboratory at Duke University took this criticism very seriously, especially Charles Stewart and Gaither Pratt. And in 1940, that team published what was a rhetorical, supposed to be the rhetorical response. This was a very well-crafted, very consciously put together response to all of the criticism that had preceded it, and that was the book Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years, which came out in 1940. So part of my thesis will focus on that. It will also focus on an exchange that took place in the pages of Science magazine in 1955, and on an exchange that took place in 1987 in the pages of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. In the third part of the thesis, that's the first two, because I'm in a psychology department, I have to look at psychological issues. So one of the things that we're looking at is how people, when they are writing under conditions of controversy, express their identity, and how they use identity talk to situate their opponents, how they bring up their information and give it more credence, and how they cut down their opponents. So I've chosen James Alcock, the critic who publishes quite a lot in the psychological literature and the Skeptical Inquirer and other skeptical literature, and John Palmer. And I've chosen them, the two of them, for two reasons. One, they're both very prolific writers. Two, they're both very, very serious people, and they have engaged with each other in a serious way. So I can look at examples of their prose written when they were writing for their friends. When John was publishing in Parapsychology Review, for instance, the Foundation's newsletter, or when Alcock was publishing in the pages of Skeptical Inquirer, when they were publishing in what were considered to be neutral venues like Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and when they were at each other's throats, as they were in one exchange in Zetetic Scholar, which is a wonderful magazine, I guess, which was published by Marcello Truzzi for a number of years and is here in the library. So this is how I came to do be in the critic business. Tonight what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the typical criticisms that people raise, also about productive and unproductive criticism, and about what criticism does to us and to the experiencer, particularly unproductive criticism. Criticism and skepticism, the idea that one does not take a claim, whether it is based on an experiment or an observation of some phenomena in nature at face value, is one of the norms of science. Scientists in an ideal world will listen dispassionately to some claim, and then they'll want to test that claim for themselves in their own laboratories or by trying to double-check the observation in nature themselves. Because it's not possible for every scientist to check and double-check every finding and every scientific claim, Other norms of science have grown up. Scientific findings need to be public. They need to be available to scientists and to other intelligent readers. Important details of the studies need to be included in the published reports. And there are certain conventions that have been developed around which one prepares or structures an experimental report or a field report. Norms of scientific writing cover the kinds of rhetoric you can use, the kind of imagery you can use, the way a paper is structured, what kinds of details have to be there. There are norms of methodology, norms of statistical analysis, and all of these norms allow us to evaluate research. And then social structures and institutions have also grown up, and then a certain amount of social ordering is possible. One can take a look at a paper, and unfortunately, sometimes this is not such a good thing, reflect on where the writer came from. Is the writer at a good institution? Was the project funded by a funder that we all know of, etc. And we use all these different details, conformance to the norms of writing, conformance to the amount of details that are there, and then social variables to kind of get an idea of how trustworthy we believe this document is. We're usually mostly wrong, but we're right enough that things get to go forward. Productive criticism bases itself in the ideal world on research and theory, and is open to debate. It can refine research questions and methods. It can allow for the phenomena to be heard even if the current consensus runs against it. This is very important in science. When I was first at Duke University, because I was interested in the history of psychology, I took a seminar that was for the postgraduate students in psychology. And one of the young professors was telling us a story about a very famous finding in classical conditioning that had been considered to be a law for about 15 or 20 years. The methodology for making this particular observation was that you came in, you observed the rats from 10 minutes after the hour to 20 minutes after the hour, and you wrote down their behavior and left. And one day, 10, 15, 20 years later, a graduate student happened to hang around and noticed that the rats sort of reversed their behavior when the time period for observation had finished. And the rats' actual interface with the target material, the stimuli in the cage, if one stayed long enough in the laboratory, was quite different than it had been thought up till that point. And this graduate student, luckily enough, was able to publish a criticism, and the criticism was taken seriously, and the phenomena, the understanding of the phenomena was changed for the better. It can also provide a research funding criteria for sensible allocation of funding. And again, in the ideal world, this means that hopefully you're able to take a look at something and decide whether or not it's reliable enough to fund. In the world we all live in, this has other consequences. One thing I want to say about productive criticism is sometimes it can be extremely useful to all of us. The publication of Rhine's monograph and that whole trajectory that happened in the research methodology of the Rhine laboratory from 1934 to 1940 was very much a result of what was going on with those critics. The methodology changed. Rhine's original experiments were very crude. There was not a lot of attempt made to screen the subjects from the cards. There was opportunity for sensory cueing. There was opportunity for fraud. Some of the statistical methods, although they were okay in terms of what psychology was doing at the time, they improved and became much more effective as that period moved forward. So there were some positive consequences of that interplay between the critics and Rhine's staff. Largely, I think, because of the willingness of Stewart and Pratt to take this seriously. Because I think on the critical side, there was not quite as much of a willingness to engage, although there were some critics who were very good about, like James Alcock does, really getting into the material and trying to deal with it. And Rhine, I think, would not have been on his own anywhere near as receptive to criticism as he was as a member of this team. Criticism can also produce a sea change, a movement away from an incorrect understanding of a particular phenomena, as in the example I was giving you about the graduate student and the rats. It also gives us an understanding of what a high standard would be. In an ideal world, parapsychology uses all of these kinds of methods, just as other sciences do. And usually internal criticism, frequently internal criticism is productive. I think there's not a lot of criticism inside of the field of parapsychology that's unproductive. However, there are some. There are some times when ideology and identity and emotion and other things get involved, and we don't have the productive kind of thing that we want. So unproductive criticism bases itself more on ideology and identity than research or theory, and it's not open to debate. The key is that it's not open to debate. It often can suppress research questions or methods by sanctioning or censoring the opposition, force the phenomena into hiding, and provide justification for withholding research funds. Quite a lot of the external criticism, particularly that which is published in the pages of the Skeptical Inquirer, for instance, shows a lack of understanding of underlying parapsychological research and an inability to see the parapsychological community as a collection of individuals. There is a tendency for anyone who belongs to a group to see the other group as this unidimensional entity, that everyone in that other group opposes me, and not to see all these variations of belief and opinion and expertise that one sees in one's own group. An extremely good, I'm going to give George another plug, an extremely good article that gives you an insight into the committee to scientifically investigate the claims of the paranormal and the Skeptical Inquirer is his article in Jasper, the Journal of the American Society, that came out in '92. There are some very important points made there, and one of the things that George touches on there that is very important to me is the notion of rhetoric, and what kind of rhetoric do scientists use when they attempt to make an opposition to the parapsychological community. The Skeptical Inquirer, for example, has often included articles that are full of rhetorical excess, as well as cartoons and other things. Paul Kurtz, who's a prominent figure in this committee, wrote an article in Gordon Stein's Encyclopedia of the Paranormal in which he said that it was perfectly defensible in science to use the belly laugh to lampoon or ridicule your opponents, because you were doing it for a higher purpose. You were doing it to save science or save the world from the obliteration of the scientific revolution. That's not what he said, but he had a lot of reasons for why this was perfectly okay. It is not perfectly okay in scientific rhetoric to use lampooning. It is not perfectly okay to ridicule your opponents. And when you engage in rhetoric of that kind, it basically signals to the intelligent reader that you have nothing left to say. Unfortunately, it's very good at swaying popular opinion and emotional opinion. It's good at polarizing the two groups. It's good at maintaining that sense of a difference, of a unolithic difference between your group and the other group. So it's good for suppressing one's opponents. Unproductive criticism can also force the phenomenon into hiding. It's very difficult to say that you're interested in a phenomena that science sees as being beyond the pale. It's very difficult to admit that you experience a phenomena that the majority of the people around you do not experience. This is not something new. In the 19th century, in 1874, there was a writer named Frederick Marvin who wrote a really awful little pamphlet called Mediomania. And mediomania was a term that he was coining in a time period when a lot of psychiatrists were coining terms for every possible kind of imagined or real or imagined mental illness that might exist out there. Mediomania meant a person who was obsessively interested in the phenomena of mediumship, or a person who was exhibiting or claiming to exhibit the phenomena of mediumship. So Eusebia Palladino would have been diagnosed as a mediomaniac. So would have Frederick Myers and Henry Sidgwick and Eleanor Sidgwick and all of the other people, William James, who studied her, because any kind of exhibition of obsessive interest in mediumship was considered to be mediomania. Needless to say, this doesn't do one's professional reputation much good to be known around your club as the resident mediomaniac. In the issue of the International Journal of Parapsychology that will be coming out in May, we are reprinting a paper on table moving, which was originally published by Michael Faraday, the 19th century scientist, in the Athenaeum in 1853. And Carlos Alvarado provides an introduction to this very ingenious description of experiments which Faraday did to show
that when a sitter at a seance comes into physical contact with a table, unconscious muscular activity moves that table. And it's 2 or 3 experiments that he did, and they're quite interesting to read. However, Alvarado quotes in his introduction that one of the complaints that was issued in 1906 by Oliver Lodge was that this particular article on table moving served to suppress research interest in men of science towards the phenomena of spiritualism and mediumship, and that even though this was a wonderful scientific finding and explained what happens when a sitter is in contact physically with the table, in some cases, it certainly didn't explain what happens when the table moves in a seance room and no sitter is in contact. However, Michael Faraday had explained it all away, so why would a man of science want to waste his time? As for withholding research funds and making all of us interested in parapsychology impecunious, my life, and the life of most of my colleagues, is a testament to the fact that you can't get rich being a parapsychologist, at least not one who's doing science. And if you want to do science in the academy, even harder. In fact, I'll tell you that coming in July is my first full-time job since 1985 in parapsychology. So if that gives you any indication of how stable the field is occupationally. These are 5 of the main criticisms that one hears about parapsychology that are sort of general overview criticisms. There are a couple of sources, more in-depth sources of criticisms. One is Champ Ransom's article, which was published in 1971, also in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research. And the other is a really wonderful review that was published by Doug Stokes in a Skeptics Handbook of Parapsychology, oddly enough. One of the first problems is that people are always saying, well, there are no definitive experiments in parapsychology. Parapsychologists have been unable to provide evidence that is absolutely convincing to the scientific community that psychic abilities exist. There is no crucial experiment. There are a couple of ways to respond to this, and one of my first ways that comes to mind has to do with the 6 years I spent at Duke University. The idea that a definitive experiment decides the issue in all other sciences is a myth. It's a myth that was created by 19th century and early 20th century historians of science who believed in the great man theory of scientific progress. This particular theory blinded historians not only to the messiness of the real practice of science, that many reported experiments, especially those that were published before some of the current conventions of scientific reporting came into place, many of these experiments were not actually a single experiment that one could start, as it started in the article, carry through as it was carried out in the article, and finish. In fact, some of them were composites of series of experiments that were then kind of glossed up into the typical, what really should work if I had done it right from the beginning kind of experiment. So, historians of the late 19th century and the early 20th century also tended to take scientists' word for how something occurred. If a scientist said, I was in that cafe on the corner and all of a sudden I thought about that chemical and I knew that if I did this, I would be able to show that this bond existed. When you go back to his laboratory notebooks and you go back to the colleagues that he worked with and you build up through interviews and through archival research a picture of how he came to that particular belief, there was no eureka moment, or the eureka moment was at the end of 5, 10, 15 years of all the pieces coming together and piling up and so on. Because historians took these reconstructions of the life and sciences at face value, we developed this notion that we need this. There's a definitive experiment. Every science has a definitive experiment, and then everybody knows it's true, and you move on to the next thing. When historians have written about the history of physics, for instance, and I am not a physicist, so this is based on Collins and Pinch. You can't blame them for my failings, but this is my source. I am not a physicist. When historians have written the history of physics in the past, they have usually said that Newton's theory of light was proved to the scientific community by a single crucial experiment using a particular type of prism, that is a bar of glass that breaks up light into its various wavelengths and colors. Recently, however, historians and sociologists of science working with Newton's descriptions of how he did this crucial experiment with what they knew about his laboratory habits, about his records, about people on the continent who were also trying to do the same experiment, about his glass makers, about how the prisms were fashioned and so on, discovered that this single crucial experiment could not have been done the way it was described. It was just impossible. And then in fact what Newton had done was a program of research leading to a particular conclusion, and when he had gotten that conclusion to his satisfaction, wrote a description that made it appear as it was one experiment, probably taking all the elements of all the other experiments that worked and putting it together in the formula that he felt would work for everyone else, and then that was published. What happened because of Newton's position in the Royal Society at the time, which was the most powerful institution of science in his day, was that if another researcher took that crucial experiment as a recipe and attempted to reproduce it and it didn't work, they would assume that they made a mistake. This is something that's analogous to the kind of thing that you'll hear from high school physics teachers who tell you, well, yes, this experiment always works. Whenever my students do this experiment, it always works. Well, it always works because every student who doesn't produce the correct result is told that they're wrong, and they go back and they keep doing it until they get it right. So, of course, this reflects nature. There are other examples, for instance, Harry Collins and Trevor Pinch in The Golem, which was published in 1994. The subtitle of that book is called What Everybody Should Know About Science. They talked about the Michelson-Morley experiment, which is always pointed out as being a crucial experiment. I won't go into the details of that, but once again, they showed that this was not exactly the way it has been depicted since then, that in fact Michelson was not satisfied with the experiment that's always pointed to as the one. He finally got a running of that experiment that he was satisfied with in 1924, but everyone always points to the experiment that was done in 1887. And then there were some changes in the way people were thinking about the theory as well. Again, I'm not a physicist, but to read this section in Collins and Pinch is very illustrative. There's also a wonderful biography of Lavoisier that I can't remember the author of at the moment, in which they went back to his original laboratory books, and one of the reasons why they did that, I think it was Larry Frederick, was it, or Frederick Holmes? Holmes. Frederick Holmes. Went back to his original laboratory books, and the reason why they decided to do that was because he reported his statistical findings to such a degree of precision that in the time in which he did his experiments, there was no possible way that he could have measured anything to that degree of precision. And it put the historian on the trail of the original research, and it wasn't quite the way Lavoisier said it was. Another problem is that there are no repeatable experiments. This tends to be kind of a confusion in terms. When a skeptic says there's no replicability and no repeatability in parapsychology, what they mean is that you can't take a packaged experiment and give it to absolutely anybody off the street and they'll be able to get the proper result. There's no such thing as that type of replicability anywhere in science. There are a lot of different types of replicability, and in parapsychology we have a number of them. For instance, we're beginning to find in a lot of the survey research and the questionnaire research that there's a connection between fantasy proneness, absorption, and dissociation, which are psychological variables, and the reporting of psi experiences. And a lot of people find this relationship with experimental subjects, with survey subjects, and all over the place. So the idea underneath there is being replicated, but the exact method of replicating it is not. So we're finding lawful things about the phenomena and the people who have them and so on, such as the relationship between extroversion and psi scoring, and some other ones, belief and psi scoring, that are occurring, but they're not occurring in such a strict way that every guy off the street can give an experiment and find exactly that relationship in their research. And I have the mean-spirited suspicion anyhow that if they did find the relationship, but it wasn't exactly the same correlation we found, it still wouldn't be replication. Unfortunately, some parapsychologists also look for strict replications, and they also put their money in the definitive experiment basket, and I think that's a big mistake. We recently heard about someone who has founded a new association whose purpose is going to be to develop that crucial experiment that can be shown to every person in science and convince everyone. It ain't going to happen. The final, no specific patterns, we have found them. The sheep-goat effect is one. Quite a lot of research in parapsychology is episodic. People take up a topic and they just run with it, and they just, there's so much else out there that they'd really like to test that they can't stick with that one topic. So there is a lot of bouncing around for people that, particularly people that have full-time jobs, because there's just so much to do and there's so few of us. However, there are examples of programmatic research. The Gonsfeld is one. The recent paper published in Psychological Bulletin, notwithstanding, which I think is an example of not the best criticism that ever lived. The research that's been done on direct mental influence on living systems is another programmatic area, RNGPK, and there's quite a lot of programmatic research that goes on in spontaneous cases if you're willing to take a broader view, if you're willing to look at certain topic areas and see where the thread has come over the last 100 years, which a lot of experimentalists in parapsychology are not willing to do. It's as if that literature doesn't exist. The final one is one of those ones that if they say this, you figure they must be out of something to say. If they're so weak, they're unimportant, and they're uninteresting. It's like a hedge against the future. Well, okay, if it exists, but it's not important to me. We find in survey research that 10% of the normal, quote-unquote, representative populations who are surveyed about their psychic experiences, 10% of the people report them. Well, if you sit down and think about what that means, we did this once with a class in Puerto Rico. There are 350,000 people on the island of Puerto Rico. Actually, there's more than that, 350,000, that 10% would be the 350,000. There's 3,500,000, I think, almost 3,700,000 in the Puerto Rican population on that island. So that means over 300,000 people are having psychic experiences. This is hardly weak and unimportant and uninteresting, and so that's not much of a criticism. One wonders, the good criticism that comes around all the time is usually methodological, statistical, theoretical, and for the most part people pay attention to it. But there's bad criticism that sticks and just never seems to go away. It's like a mythology about the field. So it makes us all wonder about why that is. Some of the reasons that have been identified, and this is actually from a talk by Deborah Delanoy at, except for the bottom one, at the University of Edinburgh that I heard her do and then took over for her after the next year. The origins of parapsychology in 19th century spiritualism and the continued existence of spiritualistic beliefs and spiritistic beliefs in the 20th century and now the 21st century. You frequently hear this cry, but we're in the 21st century, how could they possibly believe in spirits? It's ridiculous. It's like somehow we should all immediately be 600 years in the future and have it all worked out. So it's just sort of an affront to some folk. And when you look at parapsychology in Latin America and Central America and Europe and other countries, Spiritism is a huge religion. Spiritism is an obvious given about life and the way life works. So this is a persistent belief that many, many different cultures have. And for some skeptics and critics, this is an absolute affront against rationality. Then we have the professionalization of science itself, and this is kind of a sad byproduct of a normal process, and that is as each science has professionalized, there has become a set of higher and higher standards for who can do the work. In the 19th century, when Michael Faraday was doing his study on table turning, he was actually the very first full-time paid scientist in England. Before Michael Faraday and for many years after Michael Faraday, the majority of the scientists were gentlemen scholars. They were either vicars with a living from their parish, or they were young men of wealthy families, or businessmen who had made a lot of money and retired and decided to do science, wealthy landowners, and so on. So scientists were really amateurs at the beginning of the 19th century, and Faraday, in fact, suffered socially from the fact that he was paid to do science. How horrible. Well, as science professionalizes, you get societies, you get programs in the university, you get higher and higher standards for admittance to the society, more emphasis on where you got your degree, and if you have a degree, so the BA scientists disappear, and now it's the MA, and then the MA scientists disappear, and now it's the PhD. In a sense, it's just bound to happen. Unfortunately, then you get this sense that, okay, now anybody who's in our club can ask these questions. But if you're not in our club, then of course you can't. Well, and parapsychology is not the kind of science at which you can make a living or raise a family or do any of the normal things in life, really. So most of the people who do parapsychology either do it very, very part-time, or they give up some of the creature comforts of life. And sometimes there are people who have a real vocation for what they're studying, and they don't have PhDs, and they don't have MAs. They're BAs with intelligence, or they don't, like Chuck Honorton, who was one of the greatest parapsychologists of this century, didn't ever finish his BA. He was just in too much of a hurry to get out there and do his work, and he couldn't take time to mess around with these silly standards that somebody else was going to put on his head. So our field from the outside looks more like a 19th century society than a 20th century science, and we also suffer from that. Then there's this problem of protecting the gains of the scientific revolution. In George's article, again, which I read today as kind of self-protection, it has some wonderful quotes in there about one that I love to use, the one from Alcock, who talks about what would happen if psi was real. And they just see this complete overturning, this movement back to this dark ages, this influx of chaos from some nether world that's going to take us all over, that Copernicus and Galileo have saved us from, and modern scientists are continuing to save us from. Well, again, having spent some years at Duke University, I have kind of a different view of the scientific revolution than the average guy, and that's that there was no such thing. There were a lot of changes that occurred, but they didn't occur on one afternoon when Copernicus had his aha experience. They occurred over many, many years, and the Dark Ages in the medieval times were considered to be without science, were in fact full of science. There were all kinds of technological and engineering advances that were made. There were advances in medicine, there were advances in basically every area. Not to mention the fact that what we think of as the scientific revolution occurred in Western Europe, occurred in Italy and in France and in Germany and in England and so on. And there's quite a lot of other globe besides those small countries. So the scientific revolution is not seen by historians today as the one moment when we all became modern. And somehow that inoculates you against the potential chaos of the Middle Ages. The idea that some of the notions and some of the experiences and some of the beliefs that came before the scientific revolution are dangerous, it just doesn't seem to have so much weight when you start thinking about the way humankind progresses as being more of an ebb and flow of different philosophies and theories, different methodologies and so on. But you hear that from people like Kurtz. You know, if we let this happen, we let parapsychology gain acceptance, we're in big trouble here. The scientific revolution will be overturned. Another problem here is maintaining the illusion of control over the natural world and one's own psyche. I don't usually like to do this, which is to psychologize the enemy, in a sense, because I don't like for them to do that to us either. And there was one thing that I learned from being at the Rhine Research Institute in the 80s. I came into contact with Chuck Akers, who's a very good skeptic, critic of parapsychology, and with some other people who had very negative points of view about either the phenomena or the methodology or our ability to do the science without putting all our hopes and fears into it and distorting the outcome. And it seemed to me that a lot of the people who were doing skepticism and doing criticism had just as much of a good faith approach to things as we did. They truly believed that there was a danger here. They truly believed that there was something that needed to be taken care of. They truly believed that this was not something that they wanted undergraduates to learn and so on. And over the years you come to hear stories from some of the critics and skeptics, some of the main ones in fact, in which they tell of their experiences, and this harks down to the one that's a little farther down, acting according to one's own experience. They'll tell stories of a loved one who had a terminal disease and went to a psychic healer and was not healed and missed a potentially helpful set of treatments because of that shift of focus. Or they'll tell stories of another loved one who started to have telepathic experiences and then took a slide into mental illness, and they connect the two things. So there are things in their own experiences which make them crusaders against what they see as being dangerous. And when you sit down and talk to parapsychologists, you frequently hear something similar, but on the opposite side. For Carlos and I, our interest is vicarious. We have a lot of friends and relatives who seem to be sane and normal and wonderful people who have some very striking and interesting psychic experiences, and we have no reason to believe that they're not telling us the truth about what happened to them. For many people in parapsychology, they're coming from personal experiences that were very powerful and very transformative. And for others, there's just this ability to tolerate ambiguity. It's perfectly okay that the world might be a little stranger than we think it is for those folk. It's perfectly okay that science doesn't know everything. It's perfectly okay that we're still learning. And for some people on the other side, psychologically, it's not that. It's not easy for some people to tolerate ambiguity. It's not easy for them to think about the world as being really not formed yet, that we really don't know very much at all. They don't find that a happy thing. 30? Good. They don't find that a happy thing. So on the one hand, I want to give the critical community the best possible doubt that I can, that they're really doing what they're doing because they believe this is the right thing to do. And I know there are a number of internal critics in parapsychology that I have a lot of trouble believing that about. But I really think that most people do what they're doing out of good faith, that they really think they have something that they need to impart. And that's also true of us. And I don't want us to do to them what they frequently do to us, which is to see them as all exactly the same, and not as a collection of individuals with different beliefs and different training and different personal experiences. So I tend not to get into the psychologizing that many people in parapsychology do, like, for instance, Charlie Tart, who's a wonderful, wonderful guy, and a very important paper of his is the keynote article in the International Journal of Parapsychology, which is coming out soon. He tends to believe that quite a lot of people who are skeptical of parapsychology are skeptical because they're afraid of, like James Alcock, they're afraid of what's going to happen if this actually works, if there really is ESP and Psi and PK on the level that they think might happen. Usually the response that I used to hear over beer parties at the Rhine Research Center was if they only knew how hard it was to get a result in an experiment, they wouldn't be afraid of anything. Because there are psychic stars, there are people with ability, but the vast majority of people don't have as much that we need to be worried about. We're certainly not going to have gunfights with PK anytime soon, which is one of the things that Alcock likes to worry about. I don't like to say that they're afraid of Psi, but maybe they are. And then there are a lot of people that are in science who just behave as if there's no such thing as psychology. And I think that there are a lot of, and this is personal opinion, I think there are a lot of people in the physical sciences who find the psychological and social sciences difficult because they don't like to think about those elements in themselves or in their own lives. But that's too much psychologizing of those folks. The other thing is acting according to your own experience, and you see this in quite a lot of different areas. You don't just see this among the critics. A lot of psychics tend to do this too, a lot of psychologists, whoever. We tend to take our personal experience. We don't dream very much. Let's say we're Francis Crick, or whoever was that wonderful man who decided that all dreams were epiphenomena of neurological firing in the night. And those of us who dream and remember our dreams with great vividness and have had transformative dreams laugh a little, up our sleeve at that idea. But it may be that he doesn't dream, he doesn't remember his dreams, he doesn't have that personal experience. And the mistake that he's making is a mistake that many critics make and even many parapsychologists make, and that is to take your own experience and say, you see this in a lot of the books of the OBEers, for instance. They'll say, well, an OBE happens when you get relaxed and you fall down and you think about this and you think about that, and then you go to this particular place and you're only out 5 minutes, and when you come back you're going to hear a click. And that's it. There is no chord, there is no nothing. If it isn't like my experience, it doesn't exist. And that's a big mistake. And scientists are human, they'll do that too. If it's not in their experience, they're skeptical about it. If they take that skepticism and they use it in a way that's positive, to examine the question, to take other people's experiences at face value, at least for a while, then they can move forward. If they say, no, it doesn't exist because I've never experienced it, there's a whole body of humanity, a whole sense of life that they're going to miss out on. So that's a sad thing, and we do it too. And another thing is being a critic, and I'll tell you what a method skeptic is in a second. Being a critic can become a professional identity, just as being a parapsychologist is. A critic goes to critical conventions, he goes to the psychop conventions, all his buddies are critics. All the people that he knows, particularly if he has an acerbic wit, know that they're not ever going to tell him about a psychic experience that they had because, God forbid, he'll have something mean to say. So his environment, his social environment is set up around this belief system. And if he comes to a point where he says something a little moderate, like Ray Hyman did, I think a few years ago at one of the conventions, actually said something about parapsychology that sounded like maybe he wasn't being as negative as he should be, then they take a lot of flack from their friends. They take a lot of flack from the people around them. The same is true of us. We go to parapsychology conferences. If people laugh at us when we talk about experiences or about what we do for a living, we don't invite them over to dinner again. You know, you end up in a social network that supports your belief system because that's how it's comfortable to live as human beings. Ann Eisenberg, who's a graduate student at the University of Iowa recently, was all over the country talking to skeptics and talking to critics and asking them to nominate the best of the other group and the best of their own group, and then to talk about who they knew, who they studied with, who they worked with, who they collaborated with, and so on, and basically empirically proved what one would think from common sense, that there were two sets of very exclusive social networks, and there was not much movement between the two social networks. There was not much communication. One of the interesting findings of her study was that the skeptics all respected the same parapsychologists that the parapsychologists thought were the best of the lot, and the parapsychologists respected the skeptics that the skeptics thought were the best of the lot. So that was kind of interesting, that there was some cross-disciplinary acknowledgement of expertise. But socially, there was a bifurcation between the two groups. Now, being a skeptic can harden into method skepticism, can harden into the scorched earth policy of skepticism. Now, I would like to say that a parapsychologist coined the term scorched earth skepticism, but they didn't. This is from a paper that was published in Psychological Assessment by Adams and Putnam in 1994. They were responding to a critique of neurological, psychological, psychoneurology and how it's used in court cases that had been published by a man named Faust and some of his colleagues a little bit earlier. And Faust is one of those skeptics who believes that all studies are fatally flawed unless they achieve the result that he expects, in which case, of course, they're very expertly done, and that all experiments that do not come up to his level of standards have to be set aside completely. You can't give them a quality rating and kind of think about them, you know, with that in mind. You have to set them aside. And one of the things that Adams and Putnam were complaining about was that if this guy Faust and his colleagues got their way, you could never put a psychological expert to testify in a court of law that so-and-so was banged over the head and now has some behavioral or physical or motor or psychological result that deserves compensation in a civil court or can be called a crime in a criminal court. Faust wants to put it all aside. It's just not science. It's all pseudoscientific. Nobody's doing studies the way I want, and so on. And Adams and Putnam said that it's kind of depressing to be a person who's working in a science that's been subjected to scorched earth skepticism. There are a number of scorched earth skeptics in parapsychology, and they'll remain nameless. So they think all studies are fatally flawed unless they achieve the result they expect. That all experiences, and this is another thing that actually is a problem inside of parapsychology and with parapsychologists, that all experiences that do not fit the expectations of the skeptic or critic are untrue because the expectations of the critic or the skeptic arises from objective, rational, and scientific reasoning. Frequently, you'll find laboratory parapsychologists who will be told about an experience that they just do not want to hear about and is not in their experience, and therefore it just has to be the product of some subjective, irrational, non-scientific reasoning by someone who either if God forbid they should have a PhD, if they've got a PhD they went to the wrong school, but it couldn't possibly happen. And that's a problem we have inside the field. What happens then is you have experiencers who are absolutely afraid, and rightly so, to even mention what's happened to them, and we miss an enormous body of knowledge in that way. Another thing that you hear from scorched earth skeptics, and this is something that comes from the one I'm thinking of inside, Because all experimental reports conceal rather than reveal the experiments they can describe, and because all narratives of experience exaggerate and distort what they describe, no aspect of the experimental report and no aspect of the experience narrative are useful or true. Certainly, experimental reports are not exactly a true depiction of the experiment. You have journal editors to contend with. We will give you the space, but other journal editors are not going to give you the space. So you truncate your description. You may not remember everything. There have been a number of cases in which the experimenter in question didn't have his laboratory notebooks quite up to the standard they should have been and couldn't quite remember how things went and gave a description that he probably fit. It's true that when you tell an experience, you get your analysis gets in there, other experiences get in there, memory gets in there. It's very difficult to get back to the actual experience as it actually happens. So of course things are exaggerated and distorted. But the fact that things depict an experiment or depict an experience rather than describing it perfectly does not rule it out of court. It's absolutely false and not productive to set things aside because they're not perfect. You just take into account that they're not perfect and try to get out of them what you can. A scorched earth skeptic will also use whatever means available, rhetorical or social, to crush the opponent. And they have this sense of righteousness because the opponent is saying something that's untrue or irrational or dangerous to the public health or whatever. And you see a continuum of this among skeptics. There are some skeptics who are scorched earth skeptics no matter what it is, and there are some who have a particular antipathy to a certain phenomena or a certain experimenter or a certain experiment, and they'll apply this kind of rhetoric. Which gets me down to I've talked a little bit about the consequences of as parapsychologists of being too sure about what we know and being too sure about our own experience that we cut off an experiencer from telling us something that deviates a little bit from the quote-unquote accepted type. And also that it can be dangerous to be too critical of other people if you're not thinking about why you're being critical, if you're not self-reflective, if you're not realizing that we're all human beings, that no experiment is perfect, no experience narrative is perfect. So you want to go in there with your mind working and being rational, but you don't want to be one of these either-or kinds of skeptics. Some of the consequences of skepticism in parapsychology, the external social consequences, of course, is that it's difficult for us to do our jobs. It's difficult for us to get people to collaborate with us, for people to take us seriously. You go into parties and say, I do, yeah, I'm because you don't want to tell people what you're up to. Try and find a job with a long CV with lots of publications in parapsychology, forget about it. It's not easy. But then there are other things where you have to think a little bit harder about the consequences. For instance, in a recent convention, and I won't name names, in a recent convention, a team of experimenters who tend sometimes to get scorched earthish did a critique of one single experiment that had been performed very early in a particular experimenter's program of research. And they took this experiment as an exemplar of the entire program of research that this experimenter had done. They could think of a way that the results were flawed, so the paper revolved around the way that they thought of. They had no evidence that it had happened, and unfortunately the guy on the other side didn't have the laboratory records or even the panache, I think, to really prove that it hadn't happened, that this flaw that they thought might be in there somewhere could be in there. And the impression that people who didn't know this experimenter got was that, well, this guy is a little, I can't think of the American word. I've only got the Spanish word in my mind. This guy's a little flojo. This guy's a little not so good. Thank you. Not up to standards. Not up to snuff. What happens then in the audience was one of the major funding associations, one of the major funding institutions in the field, the one that gives the biggest grants. A lot of people who don't know the guy were there, and some of us who knew him were absolutely appalled that this line of research was being obliterated on the basis of a single study, and not on the basis of a flaw that existed in this single study, but on the basis of the possibility that this flaw might have existed. And because he couldn't say or prove for sure that it didn't exist, the entire life's work of this person was put in brackets. You know? To me, this is a failure on the part of these two skeptics. They may have come up with a perfectly good methodological prescription, and there were some lessons in there that we all could have learned from their talk. But because they went ahead on the basis of no evidence and could care less what happened to him afterwards, to me they had done something that was not appropriate. And that's a message I've been singing quite a lot in different venues in parapsychology, is that if you're going to do criticism, and you have to do criticism because we can't move forward without it, you've got to do it in a way that shows some sensibility of the consequences of the person you're criticizing. And if you have career-destroying or line of research-destroying criticism, you damn well better have some proof that this happened, or the likelihood better pile up on your side of the table. And in some cases, that's not done. And when it's not done, sometimes people are conscious of what the consequences are, and they decide that that's important. They just have to do it anyway. But in this case, I don't think it even crossed their minds. And to me, that's a very negative consequence of scorched earth skepticism. And it's analogous to this consequence that we also suffer when a parapsychologist hears a story from an experiencer and says, "Oh, please, that's not in the literature," and turns around and walks away. The consequences are the same. There's a deadening suppression that occurs, and we lose. Science loses. Parapsychology loses. We all lose. So I don't know, am I short? That's all I have to say. Outside of the fact that doing my PhD gives me a lot of gas, I'm always angry at these guys, and I'm always trying to understand them, because I really truly believe that there is not a lot of malintent, that there are some malevolent characters, but in general they're just trying to do the best for us, the same as we're trying to do the best for us. So sometimes it requires a lot of tomes and a lot of patience. So, yes, please.
Have you ever, I'm Dr. Holtz.
Yes and no.
Have you ever asked people who call themselves skeptics, and there's lots of them, whether they understand the meaning of the word skeptic?
Yes, and they don't, because some of them do, but I think the only true skeptic that I've ever met in my entire life, and my experience may be limited, is Marcello Truzzi. Because I think he's about the only person that understands that to be skeptical means to doubt, not to have decided against.
Unfortunately, this is also incorrect. I was in a position on a television program on Channel 5 with a man named Sonny Fox, who was a game show host, a children's show program. And we were talking about Professor Ryan and parapsychology in a serious way. And he said, "Well, I don't believe in that. That's a pseudoscience." And I said, "Have you read any of Ryan's works?" He said, "Nah, I'm not interested. I'm a skeptic." Well, at that point, I got up and I had an audience there. I said, "He's a skeptic." And they were just looking, and he looked at me and said, "What the hell's coming?" And I said, "Well, do you know the derivation of the term skeptic?" He said, "Nah, I don't know those things." So I said, "Well, let me enlighten you. Skeptic comes from the Greek term skeptikos, who were the inhabitants of the town of Skepsis in ancient Asia Minor, known throughout the ancient world for the stupidity of her inhabitants."
Ah, my goodness.
And that is absolutely true.
I know true skeptics, and I didn't know it.
Skepsis is a place.
Many of them.
And I have to be an this, so I know useless
Ah,
stuff
how
like
wonderful.
that. Skepsis is a small town, and it means dummy,
Oh, my
uninformed,
goodness.
Well,
I take it back. Marcello Truzzi is the only person I know who isn't a skeptic out of that community. No, that's not true. There's a number of them who aren't.
Yeah, and I think you should never use a term unless you thoroughly understand what it means.
Yeah.
Skeptic is a person who is basically not very smart.
Well,
Put it in mind.
I would never use that word in that way for the majority of the members of this community, so thank you for telling me that.
And I also would like to say that repeatable experiments are totally useless. I have long gone away from that. I think spontaneous phenomena is the only path to learning anything about the nature of things.
I wouldn't go that far, but I'm definitely leaning in that direction. I wouldn't go that far, but I'm leaning.
If rhetoric and humor are good at swaying popular opinion, and the critics use it, why don't parapsychologists use
Well,
it?
I wonder about
Why
that.
are we such shrinking bodies?
Well, I suppose it's because, I don't know, sometimes I think it's because we're the beleaguered community, so we take the higher ground scientifically. You know, it's sort of, and maybe that's a dumb thing. It's a phenomena that I have seen, and I don't know if this is really the reason, but it's a phenomena that I've seen that, for instance, in parapsychology, women who publish experiments tend to publish papers with 3 experiments instead of 1, like the men, and lots of statistics. And I think that's kind of a compensation. It's like, okay, I'm playing with you guys, but I'm really doing it the right way. And I think sometimes the way we talk about science, we talk about it that way. Like, because we're the beleaguered community, we have to take the high road. We have to be the ones who adhere to the ideal more than our counterparts do. And it might be a very big political mistake, actually. Yeah.
I was once invited by Paul Kurtz and the psycho people to a conference out in Palo Alto on Soviet parapsychology. And there were 400 people, scientists with a capital S. And I got up there and I pointed to Kurtz and a little old, what's his name? You know, the dwarf. And the nameless one. And I said, where would you guys be if you didn't have us to shoot at?
That's exactly right, yeah.
And the audience began to think this guy has a sense of humor.
Yeah.
And I kept teasing him all through the lecture. And the guy came up to me afterwards and says, who are you to make fun of us? It was fun.
Yeah.
Because the day before, somebody had made fun of astrology. And it's easy to do that.
Yes,
I went on to my wife and I said, how am I going to handle this? They've started, stand-up comics.
Yeah.
And she says, you'll manage. And in fact, afterwards, Bill Roll came on, was very good, and also had, believe it or not, a bit of sense of humor. It works, you're right, you see, but we overcompensate. If you say,
yeah, I
you're
think we do.
precisely right.
Yeah.
The feminist writer will use 3 examples. You will overcompensate for your low standard on the totem pole of science.
That's right, yeah.
Speaking to somebody who hasn't got any kind of degree in anything. You see, so therefore. No,
But I think it's also true, this thing about them having a profession, because it's very hard to find publications on any other aspect of psychology by some of the skeptics, some of the critics.
Yeah.
They've made their living publishing about us. So
I've published in the Skeptical Inquirer, I think on Soviet parapsychology,
Yeah.
perfectly reasonable article.
in my bibliography,
Yeah.
one of the less anxious moments of reading in the Skeptical Inquirer, I
Oh,
would say,
indeed,
quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, one gets around. And but your very fair presentation is valid. I am interested in the thing we're trying to avoid, which is to psychologize.
Yeah.
Because I have a feeling that people at some point come to a fork in the road on psychic phenomena, particularly if they have their own experiences. Either to go the fearful road and try to avoid it, or to go ahead and say, now if this has happened to me, let's find out what this whole thing is all about. That's why a certain personal experiences are valid at the very least, because they act as a dynamic. They may not be persuasive, but they act as a, what shall I say,
A catalyst.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, a catalyst. First George and then Elliot.
I found parts of your presentation a little bit difficult to understand because they're a little abstract.
Okay.
Just who do you mean by scorched earth skeptic?
I'm not going to tell you who I mean by scorched earth skeptic in this field. And I think the only one that I would, well, probably there are more, but the only one that I would absolutely hang that label on in the other community is Hansel, is Mark Hansel, because absolutely nothing satisfies him. And everybody must be fraudulent, and everybody must be lying. But there are people in our field who will say things like, every experimenter I ever talked to about their research is lying to me. And you have to raise your eyebrows and wonder, who are they talking to? But I won't identify. In the other field, Hansel, I think, really deserves that label. Paul Kurtz, I waffle back and forth on. There are times when I think he's a little more open than he probably is, and there are other times when I just think that, this is a religious thing for him, and he's out there proselytizing for humanism, and we're just all falling down in front of it, So I waffle on Kurtz, and I waffle on Alcock as well, because I think Alcock tries very hard to be fair and to read things and to be careful and so on, and then there are moments when he'll say, I really have an open mind, and the next sentence is, and it's not. So it's kind of difficult. But in our field, Not even over beer are you going to get that on. So, Ellie?
Well, I am skeptical, no matter where it comes from, of the idea that parapsychology is a beleaguered science and is taking the high road on its rhetorical skills. Because it seems to be, again, a case of, I've heard parapsychologists use these same rhetorical skills against cryptozoologists, against UFOologists.
No, that's true.
I've seen parapsychologists who've gone into these fields be ignored from convention.
But see, there's a shift of position there. When parapsychologists turn around and give the ufologists crap, they're basically standing on that mesa that the critics occupied a few minutes ago. So they're one step up in that exchange, and then they take on that rhetorical characteristic.
So I find it strange that they could take on that rhetorical characteristic
Yeah.
against people that are have a lower status
Exactly.
than this group that already has a low status,
Yeah.
and then claim victimhood a group that has a higher status through their rhetorical skills.
Yeah.
Because skepticism has their status simply through a lot of hard work and a lot of rhetorical skills and being able to sell their message to scientists.
But human beings are like that. We, you can't expect. We were talking about this. You can't expect someone who's in a strata of society that's below the top, not to turn around and behave the same way to the next step down. It happens all the time. We would like life to not be like that. We would like to be able to say, boy, these guys are in the same boat as us or worse, and treat them with respect. And that's one of the messages that Carlson and I have been hammering at the experimentalists, because inside of parapsychology, those of us who do spontaneous guesswork, particularly people who are in the field, which Carlson and I do surveys, so that's a little bit more sanitized, you can do statistics. But the people who are in the field take a lot of crap off the next step up. And it's not something that should happen, but it's something that happens everywhere and happens in life. It's a psychological dynamic. So that's another reason why one of my main messages is that we all need to be as self-reflective as possible. We need to think about what we're saying, why we're saying it, to whom we're saying it. And I think part of thinking about this has made me more open to ufology and to werewolves and vampires and whatever else, to people who are studying things that I am not personally interested in, because I have suffered on the other side. And I have to think about how I'm behaving towards them. And I don't do it perfectly, certainly, but there are some people who just don't do it at all. It just doesn't occur. And I think there we have to look back at psychology and social psychology, that you have some personality types who just don't realize that's what they're doing. They're acting out the status of the moment without really reflecting on the kind of ironic analogies between the way they're behaving at that point and the way other people behave with them. We saw that in the very first Society for Scientific Exploration convention we went to in 1983 in Virginia. Watching the ufologists and the parapsychologists deal with each other was absolutely fascinating. Just completely amazing. We had there would be these moments when everybody on the opposite side would say, wow. I remember having a conversation with Richard Haynes about a book he had just published about the problems of testimony, and thinking through the whole conversation, my God, they've got the same problems we've got. We should be talking to these guys, and watching other people have the same kind of reactions. And we all went, I'm sure, to the convention like, well, for the sake of anomalies, we've got to sit in the same room as these people. And the thing is, we're all in the same boat, so it was real transformative. There was another point where Doug Richards, who used to work for the Association for Research and Enlightenment, and I, and Bob, John, and Brenda Dunn, and a whole bunch of other people went out to dinner with Alan Hynek and his wife. And Doug and I and Alan Hynek were at one end of the table, and the very first thing that came out of my mouth was, well, how many abductees have you got? How many cases of abductees do you have? And he said, okay, this is how it is in ufology. And he gave me the whole spiel and blah, 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 and blah, blah. We listened. It was absolutely fascinating. And then there was a pause. And then he said, so, how many ghosts have you seen? It was the same kind of dynamic from two sides of a divide that really shouldn't have been there.
But I think that's where the Skeptical Inquirer and the Skeptic magazine, you kind of mentioned the popularity in the cartoons and and the horse laugh, the H.L. Mencken quote,
Yeah.
But I think that's very valuable, and that's kind of what Robert was getting, that the public organ allows scientists to get their impression of parapsychology, skeptical scientists, to get their impression not only of parapsychology, but of alternative healing, of UFOlogy, of cryptozoology, the whole thing. And on the parapsychology, paranormal side, we have those like faith and strange, which are advocate for these. Now I'm surprised at the number of parapsychologists, in particular, even more so than UFOlogists or cryptozoologists,
Who distance themselves.
yeah, they're totally ignorant of these publications
Yeah.
and these public organs out there that use the same things. They have humor, they have cartoons, they do a
But there's a difference I think you're right, that we don't pay enough attention. I mean, I remember once Marcello Truzzi telling people that there were more debunking articles in faith than anywhere else in the field, and everybody was shocked, and it's true. But I think there's a difference there in the sense that Skeptical Inquirer is subscribed to by all kinds of scientists and academics. I'm constantly running into so-and-so's uncle, the physicist, who has a subscription to Skeptical Inquirer, where absolutely nobody except us, have, and people that are even more interested in this stuff than we are, have subscriptions to faith. So it's a totally different community, especially in terms of power and the rest of it. And I think part of a parapsychologist's social need to maintain a distance, maintain a seriousness and all that stuff comes into those reactions. You don't want to admit that, well, like in Puerto Rico, you don't want to admit that you spend 25 minutes at the periodical stand reading Año Cero from one end to the other, which is like fate. So it's a different kind of constituency. You don't lose points as a scientist to read Skeptical Inquirer and say, you know what they did at the Gansfeld lab in Edinburgh? I saw it in Skeptical Inquirer. You're not going to lose a point anywhere. But for us, it's another one of these things that take us down yet another peg.
But it's only us that we know that. We lose points. We penalize each other.
It's not only us. It's not only us that knows that.
Strange.
If you're an academic, and believe me, I have been in this situation a gazillion times. If you're an academic, they know that fate is on the newsstands and that it's like, it's a crappy magazine. It's an X-Files thing. So you bring it up and they know immediately what you're talking about. The fact that you even look at it is a big problem. I mean, it really, really has an impact. I think we should be taking the high ground there too, but it's awful hard. You're already in the ditch. How much farther can you go? Dr. Holzer was first.
I noticed one of the problems that parapsychology and some parapsychologists have, and you just made a point. You were sort of when you were talking about the interest in spiritualism, it was being just fluffed off as something that belongs to the religious realms. But it does. Research into the nature of the other side is perhaps the solution to most of the phenomena, because most parapsychologists, this one not included, will try to avoid to have to explain phenomena on this side by physical means. And it doesn't work, and it will never work. The late Eileen Garrett learned that the hard way too. And then two psychiatrists came along and tried to talk her out of it. Fortunately, I talked her back into it. There is no way you can avoid explaining the phenomena except when you include the nature of what we got from the other side.
I think you're right, and that's one of the reasons that my name is on that website that supports survival research. I think you're right, and I know that Spiritism is more than just a religion. In our milieu in Puerto Rico, it's all around us as a religion. It's a religious practice, and there are two kinds. They're either the kind who say they're Catholic, but they'll tell you when nobody's looking that they're Spiritist, and they're the kind who look you straight in the face and say, I am not a Christian, I am a Spiritist. So, it's definitely part of the culture. But I believe very sincerely that that the idea belongs outside of all religions. It's there, it needs to be studied, and so on, and survival research is very important, very important. But for some people, it's very depressing that we're entering the 21st century and we still have, we can believe in energy beings, we can believe in all kinds of weird aliens because we watch Star Trek, but on Star Trek they don't believe in ghosts, so it's one of these popular culture things.
Belief, disbelief, supernatural are three dirty words. And the evidence for intervention by the other side, the term I call it, I created by the way, for the late Bishop Pike, is important, maybe more important than anything else we're doing, if we can do this on a really evidential, serious basis, and not on a matter of belief, God forbid, not on a matter of religion, because that's really killing it.
I think survival research is very, very important, and that is not a popular view inside the
And more than
field.
survival research, research of the nature of the other side, because we're dealing with a physical situation. The other side is not heaven and hell. The other side is a dimension that is around us, and we can find it, we can understand it, we can study it in a serious, non-committal way. That's what I'm proposing, and it's not being done.
No, it's not being done. George?
You mentioned you wanted to avoid psychologizing skeptics. I think that's correct. But I think there is one aspect that we do need to look at, and that's social status. And the
Absolutely.
paranormal has always been and always had a marginal social status. And until parapsychologists realize that this is absolutely fundamental to the paranormal, they will continue to complain about their level of social status.
Well,
This
you think that, let me get this straight. You think that parapsychologists aren't aware of this being an aspect of the problem?
They're not. They believe it can be overcome somehow.
Well,
However, this is
maybe not,
innately
maybe yes.
inherent, and you can go back a few thousand years and show this historically, that this has always been marginalized, and the stronger the
I'm not
phenomena
a-
become,
yeah.
the stronger the marginality becomes. Michael Winkelmann's work displays this very, very clearly, and you can go and look at even people like Max Weber, and you read Max Weber, and this is
But I
also
would want to
very
go back farther than that. I mean, I'm not conversant with medieval history, but I wonder if that's really true. If more than 1,000 years things weren't the other way around. As far as social status, I think people are aware, but they do believe that it can be overcome one way or the other. It's interesting that in the Golem, this book by Harry Collins and Trevor Pinch, they talk about, and it wasn't parapsychology, it was in biology, lizard biology, I don't know what the correct term is for that, that they have been kind of annoyed, or they have gotten a lot of flack from their colleagues because people if they take this notion of symmetry, that if you're going to treat two sides of a controversy, you have to treat them equally well and equally respectfully, and they frequently take flack from other sociologists because what it does is it takes the one that has the lower status in the science of origin and puts it on equal footing with the other one, and people get very upset by that. And there's a lot of, in science studies, social studies of science, the journal, in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been a lot of articles about not letting the studied other co-opt your findings. Well, as a studied other, I think we should keep up on everything they have to say and co-opt like crazy, because you can use this social knowledge to your benefit if you're clever. Whether or not we can be successful at it, I don't know if I'd fall entirely in your camp and say it's hopeless, but I'm not so sure that it's not hopeless. I'm not so sure that it's possible to change our social status so much. I really have a huge skepticism when people come down the pike and say, okay, now we're going to have a psychic demonstration, and now the National Academy of Science is going to let us in. Baloney.
It's nonsense.
Yeah, I think so too. You had a...
You made a passing reference to something about dissociation and imaginative. I don't know about this research. I was wondering if you could say
There have been connections made in survey studies mainly, and between levels of dissociation, and I'm not talking about pathological dissociation necessarily, I'm talking about just dissociation as a skill, fantasy proneness and absorption, and the reporting of psychic experiences. And there has been, I think there's been evidence of connections with psi scoring as well. Yes, a little bit, yeah. But what it looks like is that there's a personality type of people that are open to experience, that are able to really get involved in the tasks that they're doing and so on, that those are the kinds of people that report experiences and in some cases do better in the laboratory as well. So, and I think that's a very interesting area, and it's interesting because not only is it a new thing in parapsychology, but the idea of looking at dissociation as a continuum that can have positive qualities and be a positive thing in a person's life is not exactly on equal footing with the community that looks at dissociation and absorption and so on as a pathological problem. Most of us, or those of us who do this research, really feel that dissociation is a human potential that can be used either way and that can open you to either type of experience. So, and that's a new area. And that's an area that in the surveys, it's really holding up. And we've gotten a few people to start giving out dissociation questionnaires and absorption questionnaires and so on in their laboratory research, so we can see what kind of correlations we get with results. But it definitely correlates with reporting experiences, having had experiences in your life. Or at least so far, anyway. Yes.
When
Oh,
we
I'm sorry.
Well, very quickly.
Okay.
When that parapsychologist was unfairly critiqued at the convention,
Mm-hmm.
was there a vigorous defense by his colleagues?
Yes, there was, and I think actually it's very interesting rhetorically. If somebody was going to come along, or rhetorician of science was going to come along and do a study of that whole exchange, because he's a wonderful person, but he chose to do videotapes of his colleagues talking from their memory about what happened as a defense, that what his depiction of the experiment actually occurred, and like any human being, they all went, well, I gave it to, so the impression was not the impression he was hoping for. His other colleague who presented a statistical rebuttal did a little bit better, but uniformly, at least the people at the microphone were incensed. They were outraged. And the two people who did the critique were completely immovable. I mean, the most substantive response we got was, I don't agree with that, which is absolutely informationless. So that was a sad episode, but rhetorically it's very interesting. I think that in the years since then, which is not so many years, in my opinion, his reputation has rebounded and their reputation is on the way down. So maybe that's just my impression. But I think that in the short term, there were some poor rhetorical choices made there in terms of a response. On the other hand, there were some other things going on behind the scenes where he felt more comfortable with the person who was critiquing him, which some of us thought he was a little silly to do, and so there was some backing off on his part on his response too. But rhetorically, I think a rhetorician of science would just love to get a hold of that whole thing from beginning to end, including the questions and answers, because it was very, very interesting. So.
If you're looking for social acceptance, perhaps this will help. When I started teaching at New York Tech, we started in the psychology department, because that's how it tried to sneak us in. So after a few sessions under the aegis of psychology, we were moved out and we became parapsychology. The late Bishop Pike, when he and I were walking in California and he wanted to have a title for his book about his dead son coming to him, said, what is this parapsychology? Either it is psychology or it isn't psychology. Why do you need the para? If it's part of it, it should be part of it. And I thought about that. Maybe it should return into the fold of psychology as a advanced section of it, and suddenly social acceptance would follow.
Well, it's a perennial question, and then we're a very large community. We have anthropologists, we have physicists, we have engineers, we have historians, we have, you name it, we got it, and you don't want to disconnect them from the identity of they're already under a cloud in a sense because we're parapsychology. So, and I must say that Carlos and I have at various stages in our career attempted to integrate ourselves into various psychology departments, and it doesn't always work.
Psychical research is probably a much better name for it.
Well, there are days, when I like that name quite a lot better. I've learned anyway, I think I can speak for both of us over the years, that it just doesn't matter. If you want to do the work, you're interested in the work, and you want to carry it out, and you can do it, you don't have responsibilities that make it impossible for you to carry it out, you just carry it out any old way that you can, and not worry about whether you're getting the status or no. Because if you do it, it makes you crazy. It makes you crazy. Of course, they probably think that already, but it's not true. Did you have a question, Tom?
Well, I'm not from this field, but I just noticed that with the holistic health field in the last 20 years, there's been a tremendous change in the amount of acceptance that it's had in a very short period of time. And I think that's come from the public and not from the medical establishment, which is scientific. And I can see perhaps the same thing happening with parapsychology. Like, I brought some friends, I have an investment banker friend who came to a lecture here. She was completely fascinated. I believe that this field should connect more with the general public, and that would perhaps over time give it a little bit more of a,
Mhm.
of a chance to have more
I think it's a good strategy for some of us, and
Yeah.
for others of us, no. For the foundation, for instance, the foundation, that's something the foundation can do.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of research centers that, that's a very big norm in science. You don't go to the press before you get published in a peer-reviewed journal. So, and I think, I don't know if we always were on a lower rung than alternate medicine, but I think we're on a lower rung at this point. But one of the things that I find intriguing or possible about coming here is that I don't have to wear my Parapsychological Association hat here. So I can actually admit that I believe that these phenomena exist and that this is a very worthwhile way to spend one's life, etc. Whereas in academic context, you're sometimes a little loath to really admit something so strongly because of the social consequences, and they can be dire. But in a sense, you may be right. We'll have to wait and see. I know that watching what's happening to alternative medicine here in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere, I find very optimistic and very hopeful.
That's of course also true of vitamins, nutrition.
Yeah.
We are not the only martyrs,
Yes.
by any means. And I just have a little anecdote about one of our antagonists, the amazing Randy.
Ah,
I used to have a little office on 40th Street, and he came with his a companion to have lunch with me. And in a moment of candor, he said, "I'm not really after you guys so much. It's a religion, boys." But he didn't dare take on, organized religion.
Yeah.
We are much more comfortable target, lower target.
Exactly.
And therefore, that's where he is.
Well, I have this irrational hope that the reason why we're not showing up quite so much in the pages of the Skeptical Inquirer these days as we did to begin with is because we're getting to be a harder target. That's my rational
Or
hope.
irrelevant.
Yes.
Oh, thanks! That I don't like to contemplate, but you might be
I
right.
mean, I've talked to some
Yeah.
skeptics.
But
Yeah.
we do have television on our side. Of course, we always have
Well.
Randy with it, and we have tabloids on our side. I mean, it's a bit the sleazy one, and it's the X-Files and all that sort of thing. But there is an enormous public, except that among the enormous public, there are not the half-dozen millionaires that we
Yes,
used to have. It's a shortage of millionaires more than anything else.
Yeah.
And I'm against shortages of any sort, and therefore I think fundraising and going to Dubai or going to where the money is. But that, of course, is something for another conference.
Yes, I know.
you probably should have
Thank
Mr.
you.
Bell. You've never met Mr. Bell. You wouldn't say that.
I owned a tie he gave me, a white tie. Yes, I needed a white tie and he had one. Yeah, sorry.
I'm open to tie stories too. It's
No, it was
perfectly
just
okay.
I had a brown shirt and I needed a white tie. And Mr. Bell was in the audience and he gave me a white tie.
I see.
Mr. Belk is one of the main owners of the Belk department stores down in Florida, and he has financed.
And in North Carolina,
Yeah, yes,
we have Bell credit cards.
and he has he has financed a good deal of work in the Philippines.
Oh, really?
He
Oh.
sent Harold Sherman over to the psychic surgeon. So yes, Mr. Belk was there, but he's not rich enough, and there are not enough of them.
Well, and some of our research is so expensive. When you look at some of the stuff that the experimentalists do, the DMELs and all that kind of thing, there's an awful lot of equipment involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Carlos and I are lucky in that what we do mainly is survey research, and if you've got a laser printer and a couple extra hours, you can knock off, enough questionnaires to really take around, and if you have another couple hours after that, you can sit down with a phone book and make a sample. So.
But you see, Nancy,
But it's not
expensive equipment makes you so academically more acceptable.
Exactly. If your laboratory is fully equipped, suddenly you look scientific. There are all
And
kinds of
put on
these.
white jackets.
That's right, all kinds
Oh,
of these
yes, that's
subjective
very
things. But if you put on a white jacket, you're going to have a heck of a time getting an experiencer to tell you exactly what happened to them, because they're going to be imagining a psychiatrist coming out of the.
Oh, no.
The closet.
You dress differently. Like,
Yes.
Somebody.
Yes. No, that's what makes it interesting, because there's so many social variables. I mean, there's a million of them. Besides the rhetorical ones, the social ones, the status ones, psychology, everything. It's a whole mix. So it's another good reason just to focus on the phenomena and get on with the work.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Hi there, I'm Lizette Coley. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation, so welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.